Good evening, welcome to Policy Exchange. My name is Dean Godson, Director of Policy Exchange, and I'm quite your host tonight for this key fringe event of Policy Exchange here at this conference, The Future of the Right. Notice the title is The Future of the Right, broadly not the Conservative Party alone, but we do have a staff of all Conservative panel. I'm not sure that every single person on the panel is a fully paid up member of the Conservative Party, but it's certainly some of the outstanding thinkers and practitioners on this topic tonight. We're of course delighted that the chairman for tonight's event is Lord Goodman of Wickham, who so pleased has come to join Policy Exchange from the world of the Conservative home, where the loss of the Conservative home is Policy Exchange's gain. He is, of course, the great arbiter of Conservative politics in our times. Also delighted to be able to welcome Lord Kempsell, newly Mindy Peer, leading strategist, and also Lord Moore of Etchingham, who is leading our Thatcher centenary work in light of his role as her authorised biographer, and he will be hearing much more from him on our platform in the coming year. Of course, this is not just solely about members of the upper house. We're delighted that the two of the leading lights who actually have a mandate from the British people as well. Katie Lamb, who's contrived not to be a senior fellow of Policy Exchange through the years, but we're looking to end that. And of course, Right Honourable Claire Coutinho, MP, who has been a senior fellow member of our Indo-Pacific Commission. I know we've given the awards to welcome tonight, the usual house rules after Lord Goodman, when Lord Goodman chairs the event. No question too outrageous, we just have to state your name and organisation first. So please join me in welcoming our panel. Paul, over to you.
Dean, thank you very much. We've got about an hour or so. Each of the four is going to speak for about 5 or 7 minutes, and then it will be over to you. And thank you all for coming. We're trying to find chairs for all the people who haven't got them, because we have a very good attendance. Without further ado, I'm going to go first to Claire. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you to PX for putting this on and everyone for coming together. I think when you have these moments of opposition, there is actually opportunity to it, in that you can really have that radical rethink, which I think we need to have about what conservatism means. And I think the challenges that we face here are not British alone. You can see the struggle to be able to defend and promote conservatism happening in countries across the West. And for me, I think there's a few things happening. Obviously, we were in power for a long time, and you do get to a point where you're hemmed in by the decisions that people have made before you. And in my space, we obviously did a reset when it came to net zero, to be more practical, more pragmatic, to think about cheap energy, and also to make sure that we were doing this in a conservative way, thinking through sort of free market principles, and also putting the interests of the British public ahead of some of the international pushes that we were getting. But I would like to go a lot further, to be honest, and that was the road that we were on. But I think there's a lot of sectors that we need to do that across. And now is the time that we can have those conversations, and I think it's really important that we do, because it's very easy to look at Labour's problems at the moment, and I'm sure there'll be some Schadenfreude in the audience and at the conference, but what we mustn't risk is complacency, because it's not enough for us to just sit back and let them make mistakes and think that the public will come back to us. If you saw what happened at the last election, we got a lot of feedback from the electorate. The feedback was not good. And that was on multiple fronts. I think there was a question about our moral competence, about our economic competence, our ability to run public services, and most importantly, what we really stood for. And one of the challenges that we face now is, in our society, there are multiple threats to the values of conservatism. So when you look at, for example, the economy, free markets and capitalists, there's not many people out there defending that approach, and you've got a lot of people, particularly in the younger generation, who are very turned off by it because they feel that capital is too far out of their reach. We need to deal with some of those challenges and make sure that we have a proper offer. We need to be the party, I think, which goes after crony capitalism when we know it's not working. We need to be the party that is trusted again. And when it came to public services, again, we didn't have a very strong story to tell about the moral good that we were doing. One of the saddest things that I found in the election is the public's view of education is that we were not doing a good job. And actually, I think that was a shining example of how we transformed opportunities for lots of people in this country in a way that didn't happen in Labour-run Scotland, and it didn't happen in SNP-run Scotland, it didn't happen in Labour-run Wales. So again, pulling through that moral mission of who we are to connect people is something which we need to re-engage with and find. And then thirdly, I think the point that I would make is this, is you can't do any of this alone. Actually, one of the other things I think when you've been in government for a long time is that you get very reliant on the civil service and the groups that are put in front of you. And I think we forgot in a lot of ways to reach out and actually to find the small C Conservatives across the country, to build those networks, the people who are instinctively for us, but who felt that we'd stopped listening. And actually, whether that was small businesses or farmers or other groups, I think we have a really big job to do to go out and again engage and talk to those people. I know there's a couple of groups out there that are thinking about doing that, Conservative Networks and Conservative Together. But that re-engagement, that we are building those small platoons which make up the backbone Conservative, is another sort of big piece of work to do.
Thank you very much. And welcome, Katie. That was your second policy exchange. Very newly elected from the Order of Kent. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I feel now that the first thing that I should say about the future of the right is that there will be one. I think it can be easy for those of us who are lifelong Conservatives, particularly when we're here at conference and the Conservative Party is sort of the water that we're swimming in, to see the party as existential to the future of right-wing politics. But of course, that's not actually true. You know, people will continue to hold Conservative views, whether or not there is a Conservative Party. And Dean rightly prompted us at the beginning not just to think about this as the future of the party. But I thought I might take a minute to discuss the institutional feature of the right, which I am taking here to mean the Conservative Party, and then perhaps a moment on the ideological feature of the right. What is true is that the Conservative Party is in an existential moment. You presumably do not need me to tell you that we lost the election, but I believe I'm right in saying that the Conservatives just won fewer votes and lost more seats than any sitting government ever. It is dire. The party has no God-given right to exist and no divine right to the votes of those on the right or the centre-right of the political spectrum. And we can't blame anyone but ourselves if we want the situation to improve. A core Conservative belief is freedom, and you can't have freedom without choice. You know, no spoilers for Charles's upcoming remarks, and he is, of course, the world authority. But Margaret Thatcher said, when people are free to choose, they choose freedom. And part of what she meant by that, part of what is inherent in that, is that there is no freedom without choice. We believe parents should choose where their child goes to school, patients should choose who treats them, taxpayers should keep more of their money and choose how to spend it. And we can't believe in choice in every field other than our own. At the general election, millions of people made a choice, and that choice was not to vote for us at a large scale. We have to be brutally honest with ourselves about that and see it as a motivation to improve, which, of course, is why choice produces the best results for the public. And we will need to work to improve because, exactly as Claire has just said, there will be no natural bounce back. Yes, the Labour government is not off to a brilliant start, but that doesn't mean that voters will automatically return to us. It may be more likely that people just give up politics and politicians, or at least those of the two main parties altogether. And of course, winning an election is not an end in itself. Our efforts should, of course, go towards winning, but also towards governing and change. So what will that take? Well, first, we need a vision. What is our land of milk and honey? Where do we want to take this great country? And this has to be something worth fighting for. It has to be something that people can feel excited about, that makes them feel good about themselves when they put a cross in a Conservative box. It should be something that people want to deliver leaflets for. It should be something that people want to tell their neighbours about. And that vision should be a moral mission. Claire also mentioned talking about doing things for moral goods. This is not a managerial exercise, and it shouldn't feel like one. This needs to be about what we believe in our hearts, in our guts. And we have to persuade people, for example, that nothing will work well whilst the state remains this size. We've talked a lot about, in the early years of Conservative government's austerity and spending less money, but the moral mission here is less lower taxes, although that is obviously important for personal freedom. But it is about freedom, it's about happiness, it's about your grandma not spending 2 days sitting on the floor of a hospital waiting to be seen by a doctor. We should keep thinking and talking about this, and the future of the right relies on us doing that together. But I'll make a couple more suggestions. I do think that whatever the future of the right involves, it will have to include a new approach on border security, sovereignty and migration. There are terrorists walking the streets of Britain because they cannot be deported to the countries that they came from. At the same time, so many companies and academic institutions tell me that leading scientists, technologists, physicists can't come here because of the bureaucracies of the visa system. Both of those things indicate that something is really wrong. We need to work out the migration system that Britain needs and the specifics of how it will be implemented, and then we need to fight and fight and fight until that is done. Second, I think we need to establish a different relationship with and set of ideas for our public services. Public sector productivity is lower today than it was 20 years ago. Public services effectively don't really work. Most interactions that people have with the state are of very low quality. And it can't be the case that taxes have to rise and rise and rise indefinitely just for them to keep their heads above water. So I think we need to spend real time in our schools, in our hospitals, with our police forces, working out specifically what needs to be done. We also need to do that because governing is very hard, and it's only by thrashing out now exactly what it is we want to achieve that we have any hope, if and when we ever get back into government, of withstanding the distractions from the thousands of urgent problems that government has to tackle every day. I also think this specificity will help us win back credibility. We shouldn't do this now, basically because nobody cares and nobody's watching, and because we don't know the country that we're going to inherit by 2028 or 2029. But we do need to do it in advance, and then we need to be consistent about it. This should also give us a chance to thrash through some of those thornier issues within the family, so to speak, and perhaps not on question time or on the Today programme. And on a related note, my final point is just on reputation. There's a lot of discussion about credibility, some of which, and competence, some of which I kind of already covered in public services. But I think some of that is also personal. People need to look at us and think, these are honest people, and they want good things for the country, they want good things for me and for my family. And to do that, the only way really that you can do that in opposition, where you can't do things, is about our communication. We need to speak simply, honestly, with the courage of our convictions and with humility about what we don't know. And that's the only way that we will rebuild the trust that we need to run this country again.
Okay, thank you very much. Next we'll have Ross Kempsell, my colleague in the Lords, former director of the Conservative Research Department.
Thank you, Lord Goodman, and thank you to Dean and Policy Exchange. I'll join my co-panellists in praising the future of the right project that Policy Exchange is undertaking, because this is exactly the kind of forum in which our party can work out those difficult questions whilst we're in opposition and make best use of our time in opposition. We've heard a lot about values, beliefs, principles. All of that is very important, but I want to add another theme into the discussion today, and that's campaigning and the actual practice of winning elections. This is an area where obviously the future of the right is completely underpinned by the Conservative Party's ability to win. There is no space in the current British political system in the UK, with our first past the post system at general elections, for there to be two right-leaning parties that will produce a right majority government. Historically, it has been the primary duty of Conservative Party leaders and thinkers to hold together a broad coalition of the right in this country, so that we are able to win elections from the right and deliver for those voters. So I think we have to be very realistic about the threat of reform. At the last general election, there were around 170 seats where reform took enough votes to deny the Conservatives winning that seat, whether that seat went to Labour or the Liberal Democrats. And when I was campaigning on the ground during the general election, mainly in the home counties in England, I was knocking on doors of Conservative defectors who were moving to reform, who looked and sounded in their kind of presentation of voter identity, their values, their beliefs, nothing like what you might typically think as a Reform voter. We lost defectors to Reform from working families, from middle-aged couples with children. It is not a problem that is just confined to the seats where Reform won. So we have to be realistic about that. I think we also have to be realistic about where the voters are who we need to win back. We have to meet them where they are. In 2019, we had a huge realignment in British politics. We took nearly 14 million votes at that general election. At the last general election, that was halved to 6.8 million votes, fewer than half. We have to ask ourselves some very difficult questions about why we hemorrhaged so many voters, either to other parties or to staying at home. There are voters in that voter mix who will come back to the Conservatives if we get our strategy right over the next Parliament. We also, I think, at this conference have to be honest with ourselves about the scale of the defeat. So, not to sound a too negative note, and I think, I echo the sentiments of my colleagues who said that actually don't be deceived by Labour's initial wobble. Labour have a huge majority in the House of Commons. This was a worse defeat than 1997, when we had more than 160 seats in the House of Commons. We took the lowest number of raw votes proportionally since 1922, and that was an election that we won. This general election was the worst result for the Conservative Party in the history of our party in campaigning. So I'm afraid we have to start from there. Now, how do we rebuild the future of the right? As I said at the beginning, I'm afraid I don't think there is a plausible path for us to rebuild the future of the right unless we address the fact that the right-leaning vote in this country has now been split, and that the party in itself, in terms of its membership, in terms of its activist base, in terms of its campaigners, has also been split. It's not a problem that we can't recover from. It's a problem that we can absolutely recover from, and I'm sure we will get into thinking more about how to address the challenge of reform. But we need to zoom out from reform and look at the wider picture, which is we lost votes to the right, but we also lost seats to the Liberal Democrats at a huge rate. We were squeezed basically at both ends of our vote compared to 2019. So I want to, in this discussion, defer to my colleagues on policy, ideology, values. These are hugely important and absolutely important for us in opposition, but we will never have a future for the right unless the Conservative Party can win general elections. That is actually our number one objective as a party, always has been.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Finally, Charles Morgan, former editor of the Daily Telegraph, Lady Thatcher's biographer, and now, if I'm right, you have a new task, which is to help guarantee the editorial independence of Michael Gove. That's right. Anyway, huge task, of course. Welcome, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, very much. And ladies and gentlemen, I think I'm the only person on the panel who's not a member of the Conservative Party. I sit as a non-affiliated peer. And so I have no personal interest in the success of the Conservative Party. I do have an interest, a strong emotional interest in the success of conservatism generally. And I do believe that the right has a future. And as President Nixon said, though perhaps you're not the right person to quote, he said, it's only when you've been in the deepest valley that you can climb the highest hill. He said that just before he resigned over Watergate. So maybe but I am drawing examples from the Conservative history there because that's what Dean has asked me to do. And as a biographer of Mrs. Thatcher, the task he set me, not just tonight, but in this project, is to try and extrapolate lessons from Reagan and Thatcher to the modern day. I've been to Conservative and indeed other party conferences for an incredibly long time, and the first Conservative one I went to was in 1980 when Mrs. Thatcher famously said, "The lady's not for turning." And what she drew then from the Conservative representatives was an enormous tribal feeling of support for her against all the adversity which she faced. And by the way, if you think Starmer's beaten now because he's got all this mess early on, remember that Mrs. Thatcher had the most tremendous mess early on. And in those days, the Conservatives were a tremendously strong tribe, and I think that has weakened a lot for all sorts of cultural as well as political reasons, and it needs to be rebuilt. The next one I want to recall, which I went to, was in 1997, when the Conservatives had just lost and Blair had just come in. And it was utterly, utterly dismal. Because what you had then was, William Hague had become the leader already, and what you had then was the sort of trappings of power without any power. So the Conservative Party conference went on as if nothing had happened, and yet the whole place was deserted, particularly by my trade, by the media. And one really thought, gosh, they absolutely haven't the faintest idea of what to do. And today, I must say I'm rather pleased and interested by the fact that it doesn't feel like that. Obviously, you've all done incredibly badly. I don't mean that as an insult, but that's the collective truth. And there's some... I think it's actually very good that there isn't a leader's speech and all that stuff at this conference, because you're not ready for it and you want to find out. So you've got, if you like, 4 leader speeches and you're judging them. There seem to be far more Conservative Party members in the hall than when they're in power, and far fewer lobbyists and all that sort of thing. And I found it very interesting in the hall that people are actually thinking and discussing all these things and not thinking we're the governing party, we have a right, etc. Good, that's a good start. So what would I say, drawing from Mrs. Thatcher's example? I think the relevance comes on 2 levels. One is, if you like, ideological, and the other is the state of the moment at which she found herself. And I'll start with the latter. The reason that she was chosen as leader of the Conservative Party, which would never normally have happened, particularly 50 years ago, is because they'd done so badly. If they were doing well, why would they have picked this grocer's daughter when they could have had yet another, Oxford man in a suit and so on? And they were desperate, and she felt the desperation, but she also communicated the hope. And she was prepared. She hadn't been disloyal to Heath when she was in his government, but she was prepared, now that it was over, to say what they'd got wrong and be honest about that, and that absolutely essential part of working out what to do next. And of course she started the Centre for Policy Studies and so on and so forth. And I just one little quote about how she campaigned when she beat Willie Whitelaw. After she beat Heath in the first round, she beat Willie Whitelaw in the second to become leader. And she's at a hustings, at I think a Young Conservative conference. She has what would now be called a soundbite, and she said, you remember this is all the time of endless strikes and so on. She says, we back the workers, not the shirkers. And that was a terrifically powerful single-sentence message, because it's addressing all the problems of the time. So the workers, normally associated with the Labour Party, are actually having a dreadful time because of the shirkers, who were welfare sponges, but even then more, at that time, strikers. And so she's going into Labour territory, but with a Conservative message in Labour territory. And also it was bold. It was a bold thing to say, which dear old Willie Whitelaw wouldn't have said bold things. So it was immediate identification of some sort of mission. And then I think, and here I come to the... So she had not exactly a clean slate, but she had a special opportunity. And then coming to the ideology, if that's the right word, the thinking, the beliefs. First of all, she had beliefs. She claimed to have been born with them. She certainly had them from the age of 17 or whatever. But that didn't stop her thinking. It's just that made her think more about how to act upon her beliefs, what to do about them. Because any old person can have beliefs. The question is, if you're in politics, how do you move? How do you make your beliefs real? How do you build things that are worth building on your beliefs? How do you tackle politics? How do you tackle, above all, government? She, I think, recognised instinctively and also intellectually 3 key things which politicians tend not to link enough. And the first would be everything about economics. And the Greek word is a Greek word, and it refers to the household. And who better to explain that it's all about the household, and therefore all about life, than the first woman? Because in those days you could talk freely about a housewife and being a housewife, and she happily did. And she said, all these men have fooled you with all their jargon and pulling the wool over your eyes, but we housewives know about economics because it's the household. We know what it's like to live in an age of inflation, and you go out with your shopping basket and everything costs twice as much and so on. I think she remains the best populariser of economic ideas that British politics has ever had, or at least since Gladstone. So that she can get complicated and sometimes almost obscure ideas about the money supply or something, and turn them into something which is about your prosperity and your freedom, and you and your family. And it's a terrifically powerful combination of things. And next to that came a very strong idea of nation, because obviously the Conservative Party, and indeed conservatism in any form, is going to emanate in an individual nation, even if it has worldwide characteristics. So what does the British nation mean? And this, I think, she felt instinctively, sometimes found it quite hard to say, and developed over time in her ideas about Europe, for example. But that, and it's also very strong in her ideas about immigration, because what she said in opposition, she used one word which was considered very bad by the left of the party, but I think was necessary about it. She said, people are worried about being swamped. That was the word she used. And this was considered naughty to say this, but it was an immediate opinion poll swing to her. It enabled her to completely wipe out the extreme right in Britain. They did incredibly badly in all her time. And it was just enough of a sort of hint of why you had to think about coherence in a nation, cultural coherence, and the possibility that it would become unmanageable if you didn't have proper immigration controls, which you did have. And then the third thing was, if you like, the state of the world. And the other person who was in great adversity at the time she became leader was Ronald Reagan. He'd stopped being the governor of California. He had no position at this time. I'm talking about April 1975, when he and she first met. And they came together. He wanted the Republican nomination in 76. He didn't get it. He got it in 80. He became president after her, and the whole time he was president of the United States, she was prime minister the whole time. And so you had this amity and alliance right from the very, very beginning. And people forget that why Mrs. Thatcher was called the Iron Lady was because it's what the communists called her, it's what the Russians called her, it's what the Soviet Red Army newspaper called her, and they meant it as an insult. They thought, no one, woman being an iron, and they said, but Bismarck was the Iron Chancellor, look at this silly thing, she's saying she's the Iron Lady. And then she had the very sensible idea of capturing this, and instead of being the least bit embarrassed about it, she made a famous speech where she said, well, if you want to call me the Iron Lady, defender of the Western world, fine, I'll take it. And she especially put on a red dress so she could make jokes about that and communism and so on. And all that stuck, and it came through with Reagan and with her, and their alliance was tremendously powerful. And of course, their alliance became of world importance because it did really win the Cold War, to put it in a short phrase. And this again is relevant now because what we face is massive economic challenges which are to do with ideological challenges, again from the left. And we also face massive world challenges because at least three considerable powers are devoted to the destruction of Western values. And, Iran, Russia and China. And if we don't defend them, and by the way, I'm glad both Tom Tugg and Kemi Badenoch are very strong on this in their things today, that Israel really and Ukraine really are the outposts, brave outposts of what we believe in. And we have been very weak in defending it, and they, poor things, have been incredibly strong and in very difficult situations. So I think those three things, the nation, the economics, and the state of the world, can come together, did come together in a conservative way under Thatcher Reagan, and in their new guise should be the guiding thing to bring together now.
Charles, thank you very much. And we've got probably about half an hour for discussion and questions. So I'm going to start by taking them one at a time. If you kindly, as Dean said, say who you are when you're asking your question, that would be. Can I see any hands? I can see one right at the back there. You, sir.
Yeah, thanks, I think that what you were saying, what Charles was saying about looking back to the late 70s, early 80s is very important because then Mrs. Thatcher, Steve Jobs, tried to win the battle of ideas, tried to have a vision, and then tried to win the arguments. Now, and they also tried to develop some detailed plans as to what to do. Now, the Conservative Party needs to do now to actually try and win the battle of ideas. But first we need to establish what are those ideas. What's the point of offering on we're in favour of lower immigration, lower taxes, if we've just done the exact opposite? So the thinking and the argument needs to be sufficiently detailed to persuade people that we really mean and that we can be trusted. Next time, I'm wondering what the panel's approach.
Anyway, I'm not going to force everyone to answer every question. Who wants to comment on that?
Can I just say one point about policy? You're of course absolutely right that you have to work out what you're trying to do, and then, which is a rather different operation, work out how to do it, what the policies are. It's just worth bearing in mind that you can do the latter quite slowly if you've refined the ideas properly. So everyone now forgets that when she came into office, Mrs. Thatcher, the word privatisation was actually unknown when she came into office, and she didn't use it in the 1979 election because she knew that it was still very unpopular. She'd already got some thoughts about it, but because she then built up greater momentum and success, and the same with trade union reform, you could then enact, because you knew what you wanted to do if you had the chance, you could start to enact what had previously just been thoughts in your head. I think it's important to take the stages right.
Anyone else?
I was just going to say, I would really echo this point, us using this time to thrash out our guiding principles. Because one of the things that I saw in government, obviously I came in.
Up a bit, please.
Oh, sorry, I'm quite far away from things. I came into government quite near the end of our reign, and the thing that I saw again and again is if you do not have a very strong sense of what you are driving at in terms of your principles, then you will have ministers and political parts of your operation who are just signing off things that are being put in front of them. And what is being put in front of them is not centre-right policy. And that is partly where we got into difficulties. So, in my perspective, and people will have different views, and we should have these conversations now. We should be focusing on, for example, cheap goods and services as a way to help people with poverty, as opposed to just the welfare system. Why are we making everything in our country so expensive, and then trying to fix that through the welfare system, as opposed to thinking through how you can produce things more cheaply, whether that's through regulation or cheaper energy or whatever it might be. So that, I think, is a really key point, and it's what we should spend the time now doing.
Anyone else?
Just to quickly say in addition, not to in any way suggest that it's not important to have this policy debate. It's absolutely crucial to have this debate about how the Conservative Party can figure out the right vision, the right direction for the future of the right. But we also have to bear in mind that we have no communication with most voters right now. The vast majority of voters are not listening to the Conservative Party. They think the Conservative Party is irrelevant, and they think that the policy debate and discussion within the Conservative Party is irrelevant and not relevant to their lives. On every demographic, on every segmentation, the Conservative Party is viewed unfavourably by British voters, including over 65s, which is our traditional core vote, including Leave voters. We also have to bring ourselves up to date. Since the general election, in the past 3 months, 17% of people who voted for Conservative Party now say that they have an unfavourable view of us since the election. So, whilst it is very important to have this policy debate, we also have to think about the other elements that we need in the infrastructure to rebuild the way that we can win, and that is communications and campaigning. And if we bring all these things together, as Charles says, you have the first stage of policy development, and then you have the rather different matter of putting it into action. We've got to keep that front and centre as well.
So next, Martin Tett.
Thank you. It's Martin Tett. I'm the leader of White Commission Council as well, which is a single leadership council. You're always going to cheer in an audience at a Conservative conference when you talk about a small state, low tax government. I understand that, yeah. But in the real world, you've got to win elections. And elections aren't always won with that platform. The reality is central government A has an enormous inherited debt, partly because of COVID, 500 billion bill borrowed during that. But also, when you look at the two big spending departments, one is the NHS, the other is welfare. Both not just big, but growing exponentially terms of their pressure on national finance. So the question you're always going to face when you get to an election, you've got to win voters, not just on the right, but actually in the centre as well, which is where elections are won, is what are you going to do about the ever-growing demand on the NHS? What are you going to do about the ever-growing demand on welfare? And how are you going to face questions like Kenny did yesterday on maternity, and not say, oh yeah, we'll cut maternity, we'll cut this, we'll cut that, and then still win the election. So I think the right, it's okay to talk about low tax in state, but you've got to have answers to those big questions when you get to an election.
Who wants to get in?
So there's so many things in your question. The first thing is I do think that whilst lower taxes in a smaller state tend to be always talked about together, they are actually sort of separate things. You can have a big budget for a state that does fewer and fewer things, and I suspect that will end up being inevitably the direction that we have to go in order to continue to service the two big budgets that you talked about. We will also need to have reform. There is just no way that for either our health service or our welfare service that the answer can just be that we have higher and higher and higher taxes forever. But there is so much that government does that it effectively doesn't need to do. And Claire will know so much more about the energy brief in that than I do. But that's a classic example where not only are we making things harder for everybody, but also making things much more expensive. There are so many things that we could do to have a smaller state that may not or may not immediately mean lower taxes because of these spending pressures that you're talking about. On the question of where the public is, generally what you see is the pendulum of public opinion, if you like, swings against the government over time. So when you come to the end of a period of time that the Conservatives have been in office, the public is starting to think, maybe we would like a bigger state, more spending, more focus on public services, and that tends to swing back as you then have people who are left-wing in government by the end of the Blair-Brown years. People were desperate, according to the polling, for things to be slimmed down. So I think some of that actually will slightly happen naturally when people see that what's happening under Labour isn't working. The job for us will then be to win them back to the Conservative Party specifically. But I think there are lots and lots of things that government could stop doing that wouldn't impact the day-to-day lives of almost all of our citizens, apart from for the better.
Anyone else?
I do think you have to. The health service is even more difficult than welfare. I think it would be. So your question is essentially right, but I think everybody is aware that welfare is out of control in certain ways and is unjust. And in fact, one mustn't think that people who are relatively poor are all very happy with welfare. They're disgusted by welfare because of its weird distribution, so that you can be, I know someone like this who is living with his family and he's working, and there's somebody next to him who actually, in a pretty grotty estate in Hastings, who makes really a lot of money out of benefits because he's a clever chap and he's a sort of benefits entrepreneur, if you see what I mean. He's worked out every possible scam you can do. And there's a lot of feeling about that sort of thing. And by the way, Labour is aware of it, aren't they? And they're starting to talk about it, and they are saying they're going to have to address it. So I think there's some political mileage to be made there, which might be able to shift it. Particularly things like so many people not working through and claiming sickness benefit, which is an extraordinary situation. And the only other thing I would say is, I think there is, but I don't know if Conservatives will ever be brave enough to do this, there's a great bust-up coming about net zero, where enormously unnecessary costs are being imposed on people. And it's let through without any proper debate in Parliament. It's disgraceful for all parties, I feel. And these are unreachable targets, unreachable in the time set. I'm not saying there shouldn't be attention and policy about climate change, but the specifics of net zero in that time is an arbitrary time scale, terribly costly, terribly misleading. It will massive misallocation of resources, destruction of our considerable energy advantages and so on. And I think this one will have to be fought out quite soon, actually, and I imagine the Tories will be at loggerheads with one another about it.
Well, just before you come in, just because you're interested in organisations and campaigning and party all of that. The Conservative electoral revival, if it will begin in local government, won't it?
Yes.
I mean, this is, there'll be a lot more Martin Kempsell, and the Conservatives will start winning councils, and you'll have sort of figures like Sandy Bruce Lockhart after 97, who was the most senior elected Conservative in the country, because he got some power, which the Conservatives and the Commons didn't. Yeah?
Yes, that's right, and the path to victory is going to be won in local government, in the mayoralties, in by-elections, in parliamentary by-elections, in other forms of elections before we get to the general election. And as you'll know from campaigning in local government, equally as important as what we think as Conservatives about issues like public spending, welfare, and these crucial issues, are what are we saying about where the government is on that. And since the general election just gone, we have a Labour government which has promised massive NHS reform. Has it begun in any sense to deliver on those promises? Not that I've seen. We had a government that has promised a huge amount of commitments on education. Instead, it's about to put a tax on education at the budget. We have a budget coming up on the 30th of October. In my view, my personal view, I think it is regrettable that we do not have a Conservative Party leader in place by that point, although I respect and understand the important process that's happening at this conference where we're listening to various candidates. From a practical campaigning point of view, yes, it's crucial what we believe as Conservatives about these matters. It's also crucial what is our position on where the Labour government is going, because there is a huge amount of weakness, fundamental weakness in Labour's vote. Labour ran a very deliberate strategy at this general election to pile their resources into the marginal seats and to leave their core seats uncampaigned. That means that there are a huge amount of votes that are potentially there for the taking by us from Labour if we can recover a conversation with those voters.
Yes, because I'm afraid I'm going to have to go to have a radical conversation on net zero. Charles will be very pleased. And just to say, I think this is an example of an area where actually there is a really good debate to be had, because Charles is right. If we were continuing on the way that we were going, we were setting ever more prescriptive targets when it came to decarbonisation, which actually was central planning by the back door, which we know as Conservatives doesn't work, and we're at risk of making our energy so expensive that the way you're decarbonising is you're moving businesses from here to countries which are still 60% powered by coal. Now that makes no sense whatsoever. You're actually adding to global carbon emissions. And I do think it's time we have a radical sort of rethink about this, because on the one hand you have Ed Miliband, who is almost like a messiah in his belief that these targets that he's completely made up, which there's no evidence for, are going to be able to deliver the land of milk and honey. And of course they can't. We know they can't. And on the other hand, actually, you have Reform who say don't do anything in this space, which actually I don't think is the right answer either, because although we shouldn't be myopically focused on our domestic emissions of 1% of global emissions, actually we can do a lot when it comes to the 99% of emissions which happen elsewhere, through the fact that we are an amazing an economy that innovates, that can export technology to other parts of the world, and that would be good for our economy as well as helping to solve a global challenge as well. So yes, I do think we need to have that conversation and again recover our Conservative principles in some of these areas and think about what it means to do them in a Conservative way. On that note, I must go and make that argument elsewhere. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to take two at a time. I'm going to take one there and one there. The gentleman with the red.
Sorry, thank you. Just talked earlier about how important choice, Jean Jones, earlier. Just talked earlier about how important choices when it comes to politics. I'm reminded that one of the big things about markets is creating disruption, where things can die when you first be created. So the question for the panel, is it worth saving the Conservative Party? Is it worth letting it die and doing something new?
Good. Okay. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Andrew Harley. I'm a local area chairman of Birmingham Coventry, Surrey American. I was a GP for 38 years. People utter intellectual process to rethink that word, because we really need to look at the process and take the whole thing apart and looks at it from a perspective of how you get an individual people helping that process, rather than top-down reorganisation that doesn't work. You need to basically put the patient back in charge and think from there. You've lost the contact with the professional and the doctor. You need to bring it from that perspective.
Right, so we've got rejigging the health service and closing down the Conservative Party. Is it the other way around? Who wants to?
I'll pick up this question about choice. I mean, given that I have just been elected as a Conservative MP, you will be shocked to hear that I don't think that the Conservative Party should be euthanised. But I do, I really believe what I said earlier. It has no right to perpetuity, and any institution is only, the only reason that any of us are here are for the good and the future and the happiness of the British people, and any institution that ceases to serve that aim has no right to exist. Have we really tried to make things better? I don't think yet that we have. That's the work that we're going to do now. But of course, we might fail. That's possible. And if we do, we'll have to be honest about that and find a way to move on. Because as I said earlier, the right is not going away. It's right and centre right wing policies and conservative, whether you capitalise it or not, ideas will exist and will be held by what is really the majority of British people. Likely forever, but certainly for the foreseeable future. But does that have to be through the engine of the Conservative Party? No. Do I hope that the party of Disraeli and Churchill and Thatcher can get its act together and do that? Yes, I do. Do I believe that it can? Yes. But we'll have to see.
Can I just say something on the health service? Goodness knows how this can be done politically, but I have long believed that the National Health Service was a catastrophic mistake from its foundation rather than something that's gone wrong. And the trouble is that this is always presented, if you say that, people think you mean that everyone's got to pay the full whack. That's not what I mean at all. I think it should be free at the point of use. But it was planned at a precise moment in history when everybody, when any left-wing person thought that you could do the whole thing centrally. And that's a disaster from the word go. And people think as if there was no history of health in this country before. There was a very, very distinguished medical profession with many very good hospitals. And they tended to learn through the profession and through making those hospitals good rather than some universal overarching system. And indeed Ray here had founded Barts in 900 years ago or so. The way to understand this is to look at perfectly civilized countries, none of whom have a health service like ours, except Canada. And they all have health services which are based on insurance, partly on insurance systems and partly on work, your employer provision and that sort of thing, Australia, Netherlands, Germany, etc. And none of them work perfectly, it's a very difficult subject, but almost all of them work better. And I now think everybody's common experience of being in hospital is so bad now, and of waiting for the GP, and so that people are actually beginning to be. I mean, when I've talked about this on platforms year after year, I just don't get booed so much now, and sometimes people even clap because they recognise the absolute dissociation between the sort of quote angels and these marvellous self-sacrificing. Many of you are very self-sacrificing, but it's the system that is so antithetical to people's needs and patients' needs. And I think the key thing to get through is, first of all, that it is so bad, and secondly, that it doesn't have to be like that. There isn't only one way to do it.
I'll stick to my province, which is whether the Conservative Party should be shut down. There's not an existential force that is going to shut down the Conservative Party. We're currently busy doing a pretty good job of it ourselves. So the question for the Conservative Party is whether we want to shut ourselves down. And the answer has to be no. It's the only vehicle to deliver a Conservative government for Conservative voters in the UK. It's the only plausible way of doing that in our electoral system, and we have a duty to those voters and a duty to every voter and citizen who is going to be rapidly disaffected with the Labour government to deliver a Conservative government for them as quickly as possible in whatever the detail of the ideological shape or form. The reason we are currently, I'm afraid, in the process of putting the shutting down sign up on the party storefront is because the vast majority of voters of every segmentation, every demographic, the one equity that they believe about the Conservative Party is that we're a divided party. And Labour managed to somehow, despite their enormous internal divisions over the past Parliament, produce a platform of party unity that allowed them to deliver a campaign which could win a general election. And we will not win a general election if we are a divided party. So whilst this process for the election of the leader and the conference and the policy process is hugely important, we are going to have to come to a point in this Parliament where we stop doing this and we have a clear and consistent platform that we can communicate to voters under a leader who remains in place for more than 5 minutes. Because we have lost a huge amount of trust and confidence with the electorate, because we have burned through multiple leaders of the party over a very short period of time. And we cannot win if we are perceived as divided. So, the question for us is whether we want to stop going down this path or whether we want to continue. And I hope that we'll stop.
That's about our final two. I'll take Martin and the gentleman next. He's had his hand up for a long time. But second, so Martin first.
Hello, Martin Owens. Mrs Thatcher had the great advantage of a divided left that kept her in power. She scored great election victories, but if you added up the Liberal SNP parties and Labour, their vote was larger. So what is your theory about the split on the right and the voting power on the right? How would you overcome that? And I noticed that at least one columnist in the Daily Telegraph this morning is suggesting that you do it by merger.
Yeah.
So my question is yours. My first cycle music point is that for years I've read Charles Hall's fantastic trilogy on Mrs Thatcher, that every Conservative MP should read that trilogy, and I was going to buy all of
No need, I've got my copy already, no need.
Because that also is part of when things go back, that's really missing. On the division point, that question process that last week, I struggle to see what the ideological differences are with the Conservatives. So we have someone who said it's on two parts of one nation, Tory, other people talking about far right and reform. We all seem to believe pretty much the same things. So the taxation around 40% top end, 20% higher bands, and sensible immigration. It doesn't seem to be very much divided, unlike possibly the Labour Party. So when I look at the future of Labour, picking up your point, sorry, Conservatives picking up your point, I don't see what these ideological differences are that should drive us apart.
So, what do we do about reform, and aren't they the same as us anyway? Charles?
Well, I think they're both very interesting and pertinent questions. There always are and should be quite big divisions within a big political party. It's one of the reasons I'm against proportional representation, is it splits all these divisions into little parties, which is not actually in the public interest. And it's a good discipline for a party to have quite some tension. So traditionally, for example, about free trade versus protectionism within the Conservative Party, not a bad thing at all. But I think you're really onto something, because what was the actual split that has been so damaging, specific split that was so damaging for the Tories? And of course it was Brexit, wasn't it? That was where people really began to hate one another. I mean, the seeds of the hatred were sown partly with the political assassination of Margaret Thatcher, which was also about Europe, of course. And that's sort of gone on and on. And it gradually grew to momentum. And David Cameron sought to cut the gauntlet not by having the referendum, but bungled his campaign, and therefore made it far worse from his point of view. But therefore, the good news ought to be for the Conservative Party that argument has more or less ended. I mean, some people will dream of rejoining, and maybe if everything goes totally wrong, that will happen one day. But it's not really on the agenda, is it? So almost all the people who want to be a Tory leader now want to make Brexit work in one way or other, and they don't really disagree about it very much, it seems to me. But they've got plenty of healthy debates, and whereas I think that I don't want to be too optimistic about the Tories after all this horror, but Labour have got a massive problem, which you can see already. There really is a great big difference between Blairites, perhaps the three ways, but Blairites, Starmerites and the left. And it's about to be very difficult. I think if the Conservatives and Reform, I don't, by the way, think there should be a deal with Reform. I think it's a question of reaching and explaining things to Reform voters rather than, and improving your own thought rather than doing a deal with Nigel Farage, which I'm sure would go wrong. But yes, the grounds for agreement are pretty high, actually.
I think that was actually very well summarised. The only thing that I would add on that, perhaps, is somewhat surprisingly and maybe counterintuitively, of the voters who left us in 2024 and voted for other parties, bizarrely, including Reform, do not think that the solution for the Conservatives would be to merge with Reform. So I suppose earlier what I was talking about competition, my hope, my aim, what I hope we will all be part of is that competition makes the Conservatives stronger such that we can win these people back in our own right, and I think that we should at least give that a really good crack before we decide that it can't be done.
I think we will only do that by focusing on the priorities of voters and being ruthless in our focus on what matters most to the voters who we need to win back in order to win. Some of them will be Reform voters, many of them will vote Liberal Democrats, many of them will be Conservative voters who stayed at home. There's a huge range of issues here for us across the whole spectrum. I'll go back to the point that I made about the 2019 coalition, which was an unusually strong realignment, geographical, demographic realignment of vote in the UK. We have not answered the essay question as a party about whether that realignment can be won back, whether it is permanent, and that is tied into a lot of the questions about who we should target at the next general election. But we should bear in mind that the debate about which leadership candidate is more similar or different to others on immigration policy or one nationism, it bears a lot of relevance to us, but very little relevance to the voters that we need to be in a conversation with.
But just on that point and to your point about are we kind of more similar than we are different, it's worth remembering that for voters who defected from the Conservatives to Reform in 2024, the top issue for those people was immigration. For Conservatives who defected from the Conservatives to Lib Dems, the top issue was also immigration. So if you poll these people, they are actually much more similar than you would think. It's easy to think that those are sort of splits to the right and left. It doesn't quite work like that.
On which note, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. And thank you all for coming, especially for the people who stood so patiently at the back. In thanking the panel, I also want to thank you, because after years and years of doing endless fringe meetings, it is a pleasure to do one where most of the questions are actually party members rather than lobbyists, which has been my experience over the last few years. So, leaving you with that encouraging thought, I ask you to thank Ross, Charles and Katie, and the absent Claire Coutinho in the usual way.